Welcome to Leg 6 of the Race to Replace. Every week we dig into the Liberal leadership race where 5 candidates duke it out for the ultimate prize, your name on hundreds of Alberta truck flags. I'm Dan Arnold. With me as always, Vandana Kattar. And for the 76% of Canadians who don't know who that guy is next to me here, that's Tyler Meredith. This week on the podcast, we're talking polling again. This time we've got polling among Liberal members, though. And unlike the Daily Curse of Politics poll, this one might surprise you. We've also got some fundraising returns. These will definitely surprise you. And based on all that, we're going to kind of figure out what's the best path forward for candidates when it comes to debate prep for next week. Tyler, Vandana, how you guys doing? Did you make it out to the Canada First rally on the weekend?
No.
I did not make it out to the Canada First rally, but shout out to the 24% of people who said that they know me. Apparently, my universe of followers is bigger than I thought.
I feel like I would not be welcome there. They would like identify me and kick me out immediately.
All right, let's just jump into it. We've actually got a lot of interesting topics to get through this week. We got a lot of data, and let's start off with some fundraising data. Money is the name of the game in these things, and we've got lots of information on how the money is looking. So first off, all 5 candidates made it through the final money call from the party. They are all stamped candidates. Now they will all be in the debates next week. This is actually surprising. I expected a few people might not be able to make it through this final check they had to pay last week, but they all did. So that's $1.5 million into the Liberal bank account. Great news for them. And now I know that you two, like myself, are lovers of discussing the intricacies of directed donation wire transfers between political parties and their candidates. And if any listeners are also into that, boy, you're in luck because this pod is going to be lit tonight as we get into that sort of details because we have some fundraising returns. The very first fundraising returns were made public on Tuesday this week. So bear with me, Tyler and Vandana. I've got a bit of heavy exposition to get through here.
This is Dan's policy time. Let him have it. We listen to Tyler. We'll give him we'll give him his flowers here.
He loves his data. Let's turn it over to Dan.
All right, so bear with me here. This is going to get a little complicated. Maybe get your notepad out, get your calculator out, so you can follow at home here. Elections Canada has made public all the fundraising information from the candidates up until February 5th. We know the candidates have raised money since February 5th because they all made that deadline last week. So they've all raised at least $350,000, even though these returns show a lot of them with less than that. But we do know how much they raised in the first couple of weeks of the campaign. Mark Carney raised, drumroll please, $1.9 million from over 11,000 donors. Wow. That's significantly more than the rest of the field combined. And also, if you're looking for other context, it is, it's about what Trudeau raised in the entire 2013 leadership race. Poilievre did raise.
There's been inflation.
That was over months too.
That's true. That was before just inflation. So,
Dan.
Poilievre more recently raised $10 million, though, from over 62,000 donors. So Carney's got a long way to go to match Poilievre. But if you go back and look, how long did it take Pierre Poilievre to get his first 11,000 donations? It took him 40 days from when he got his first donation, 64 days since he declared his candidacy. So Carney is well ahead of the pace that Pierre Poilievre was on back in 2022, which is obviously, good news for a party that's been getting trounced by the Conservatives in fundraising returns ever since Poilievre became leader. Before I go on and talk about Freeland's fundraising numbers, because that's really going to get complicated, let's pause here and just talk a little bit about the Carney numbers. Vandana, what do you think about this figure here? It's pretty big, right?
It's huge. I mean, I was on Trudeau's leadership, and that was over a span of months. This is like a month. Like, how much time has really passed here? Is one thing. Now, I expected Carney to have big dollars, but I was trying to catch up with my nerdiness and look through it. I was actually surprised at how many little dollar amounts he got. So $10, $50, $25. I saw Brandon, I saw Cochrane, I saw small towns across Canada. So while I expected that someone of his, gravitas and the people he would know, I expected him to get big dollars out, but I was curious if he can get grassroots dollars out. So it looks like he has been able to, which is actually very good for his campaign. So it's more than just like, here are some bigwigs that may not knock a door. These are people in small areas that hopefully signed up, will probably signed up, will come out to vote, who are passionate about it, and they're diverse across the country. So that's pretty impressive in a short amount of time.
Yeah, average donation about $170 per donation for Carney, which is, on par with Gould.
Hmm.
It's a smaller donation on average than Freeland. So yeah, he seems to have gone for a lot of small donations from a lot of people.
And it's not just the average, right? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but because in the Elections Canada data, you have to separate out the amounts that are over a certain threshold and under a certain threshold. And so, of the 11,000 or so donors that he has, about 7,000 of them are in the small donor category, which means like 70% or more effectively are it's not just that he had a large number of donors that was spread out with dollar amounts at different degrees. It's that he actually had the majority of his donors were really in small dollar amounts.
Okay, so great results for Carney. This is where it's going to get a little bit complicated here. Thanks, Christia. So these are the numbers from the other candidates. So Carney, 1.9 million. Karina Gould, $236,000 raised from 1,375 donors. Gould, notice the second name I read there. Third name I'll read, Christopher Freeland, $227,000 from 332 donors. Bayless, 227,000, same amount as Christia raised from 188 donors. Ruby Dalla, 140K from 107 donors. Obviously, she's over 350 by now, though. However, this is, as I said, if you looked at those numbers and you said, oh my God, how is Christopher Freeland tied with Frank Bayless? Something seems off there. Well, yes, because something is off there. So the Freeland campaign did reach out after this first came out. They also posted a clarification on Twitter. The way it works here is that the party collects the donations at this stage and then wires the money to the candidates. Most of the other candidates signed up to get regular wire transfers from the money. The Freeland campaign, now given she's a former finance minister, always looking to save a little bit of money, and wire transfers do cost a little bit of money. So they signed up to get the wire transfers less regularly. So therefore, the last week basically of their donations compared to the other candidates was not wire transferred to her yet by the time these returns came in, which means she was basically cut off from about a week of donations compared to the other candidates here that you see in those returns. The Freeland campaign then said today they have raised $600,000 from about 2,000 donors. Now that, though, is up to today. As I mentioned, all those other donations are up to February 5th. The Korean Gould campaign also reached out. They said they've raised from 3,000 people up until today. So, I think it's hard to compare all these figures. We're talking about different endpoints, different cutoff dates here. But I think what we can say is, Carney obviously well ahead of everybody else, in first place. Freeland has raised more money than Gould, but Gould has significantly more people who have donated to her campaign, maybe 50% more than Freeland. Tyler, what do you make of the fundraising situation then? Carney obviously well ahead, but we've actually got a bit of a race for second place on this going on here.
Well, yeah. So I think Karina's actually very close to Krista's number if it was updated to today. They wouldn't share the exact number with me, but my sense is that it's quite healthy, which means that it's a very much more competitive race. Which we'll get into the polling. It's much more competitive race for second than I think we were expecting. The other interesting thing here, two things I would say. One is, whether it's 600,000 as of today versus 1.9 million as of 2 weeks ago, like Mark Carney is either 3 times or 8 times ahead of Christopher Freeland, right? Like almost logarithmic scale difference, which again also explains this sense of strong momentum that he has, this sense of inevitability. I don't think it's inevitable, and we'll get into why the polling is a bit of a different story. But I think obviously the resource differential also speaks to me, something that certainly I've been picking up from a number of my sources, is that the Carney campaign has been in a very active hiring mode, right? Like they are starting to roll out staff in all parts of the country. I'm hearing regularly now of people who are going off on leave to start on the campaign, which presumably means they're being paid. And they've got clearly the resources to pull that off, and probably more resources than they need even for a very large complement of staff across the country, which also means that they, if they win, and the party, if they win, will be well positioned to have a surplus going into the next campaign.
Vandana, what do you think about how the field's shaping up here?
Um, I would say that now I always thought she would do it, but Karina Gould has shown herself to be a viable candidate, and I think a lot of people saw her as the underdog and saw that she, wouldn't be able to make it, but she has, and she's quite competitive. So I think there's definitely a race for second place. And like if you look at what happened with Stéphane Dion, like you never know what can happen if someone doesn't get 50% over 50% off the top. So I think that's interesting. I find that it's more like for me. the amount of people donating matters because that's more votes. So I didn't get to go sparse through Karina's donors and who they are across the country, if they're in one area or not, but I have been hearing that she's having really good luck in changing IDs, in grassroots, and I think that shows the power of like grassroots traditional organizing. That yes, you're against the behemoth of the Carney team, but that she still has not only made a name for herself. Where the problem is being House leader, like you're not out of Ottawa very often, and she was on a mat leave as well, 2 mat leaves, so that takes her time away. But whether she is today here or she's there for the future or can be a great tool for Carney should he become prime minister, I think those are all huge options for her. So she's had a lot of opportunity for her.
Okay.
I'm also shocked that Tyler said campaign staff get paid because I think all of us have gone through
Yeah.
the slave labor, and I'm like,
I'm assuming to be clear, I'm assuming that based on what I've heard, but we don't
back
we
in
don't know
my
that to be true.
day.
Yes,
But
yes. Can I just say, Dan, before we leave the segment, because I think it's also super interesting who is on which list, because of course this is transparent, this is open and public. You can see who's donated. Go online, you can have some fun. If you're looking, you're looking late at night to want to see what's interesting. A couple of names in the very short time that I had to search that popped out to me. Interestingly, Michael Ignatieff has popped up and has appeared to have donated to at least 2 campaigns. He might have donated to more, but I at least looking at Chrystia Freeland's donor list and also Mark Carney's donor list, Mr. Ignatieff of Vienna apparently appears there. We're assuming it's the former Liberal leader, but there's a Mr. Ignatieff of Vienna who appears on both of those lists. And also, interestingly, it appears that Bill Morneau has donated to Mark Carney, which I have to tell you, I'm a little surprised by because folks will remember that when he was finance minister and when I was certainly working in his office, there was a constant question as to whether or not Mark Carney was going to be potentially his successor. And so I'm a little surprised to see his name on that list as a donor. We'll see, of course, where other people shake out. And again, if you look at Karina's list, there's some very interesting organizers of people in different parts of the country, which I think, to Vandana's point, actually speaks to her skills and to her following within the party.
It
Yeah,
sounds a
Bill,
lot that finance minister is like, that's a tough job. Like someone's always trying to take your job, it seems like. So
well,
poor Bill,
especially
but
Mark
yeah.
Carney. We've heard this week he was slated to replace Jim Flaherty as finance minister
Everyone
in
wants a bit of
addition to
Mark.
Carney and Freeland. So that's 3 finance ministers that he's been rumored to be taking out, but never did over the last decade.
It's interesting. Well, yeah, that's 2 different prime ministers of different stripes have wanted him for the role. So I think he's trying to appeal to a broad base of voters.
Any other news from this week before we talk about polling that anybody wants to caught your attention, you want to bring up, you want to highlight?
Look, I think obviously the course of the last week we've seen a number of interesting policy proposals. We'll get into that when we talk about unanimous consent. But I just think it's been interesting to watch. We've seen a bunch of interviews, particularly for Mark Carney in French media. He's done a bunch with Radio Canada. He's clearly been practicing his French. He clearly knows that he wants to get out in front of what is likely to be a very important test in that first debate that we have obviously coming up next week. And I think it's interesting that Carney decided to do the sit down with Radcan. Because there's been this criticism that he's been not necessarily out doing as many interviews domestically. We still, of course, have an open invitation to him if he wishes to come on the pod, and to Chrystia Freeland and to anyone else. But it's interesting that he did both Radcan and CBC because I think he wanted to be able to go into this debate having shown off those skills because it was starting to become a point of criticism that I think the Conservatives in particular were starting to level at him.
Yeah, and I'll talk a bit about the Rosemary Barton interview. And I was also like, it was good that he did it. Rosemary Barton's also a tough interviewer. Even when I'm on panels with her, I'm a bit more on guard than with other people. But I would say, I think what he's showing is something very different from what Canadians are used to seeing from politicians. If I just think of like Doug Ford, Justin Trudeau, Pierre Poilievre, they're more like theatrical, like PR focused kind of politicians. Carney was very focused on just getting the facts out. He wasn't trying to be like, I didn't see a lot of small talk or stories or anything. He was just really going through the facts. And I think people haven't seen that since Harper, really. And not that I want to compare him too much to Harper, but I think you're seeing like almost like a return to, I will say, like Chrétien, Martin-esque type of leaders, which Canadians, given the economy, may want right now. And also how to how to get across a large segment of voters at the same time. So I thought that was interesting that it's the same tone. He wasn't trying to be someone else. He was just being like, "Hey, I have credentials. I know how to do this job. Here's like," and I think he was trying to get really into like a bit more of the details then. But I think he knew that with Rosemary Barn he could do that. But I thought that was interesting. I was curious what kind of persona he put on, but he was just being himself.
There is comfort and power in the ability to grow old and then grow older and remain in your own home. Hard to argue that. For so many seniors, it speaks to safety, confidence, and the ability to live with a sense of independence. I've lived these kinds of issues as a caregiver in my own family, and I've seen them play out in my friends' families. We have some of the best hospital care in the world in Canada, and wonderful community health services too. But even so, finding the right kind of care can be confusing, intimidating, and time consuming. And that sometimes means our loved ones are not able to stay, to live, to thrive in the place they love best. I started telling stories last week about our presenting sponsor, TELUS Health, a Canadian company, and how through world-leading technology, they work to support and deliver better health outcomes. TELUS Health Home Thrive is one of those technologies. It's an innovative care navigation platform that transforms aging in place support for seniors and their caregivers. In collaboration with government and healthcare providers, Home Thrive seamlessly integrates public and community services, provides additional digital-first health and well-being solutions, as well as emotional support. It works. In a recent survey, caregivers reported less burnout. 56% of patients said Home Thrive helped them avoid hospitalization. 88% said it reduced their need to move from home to a senior living facility. And it's not too difficult to see how all of this has major impacts on reducing stress to the system and cost of care. But the point is home. As a perceptive someone once said, there's no place like it. Another good TELUS Health story to come next week.
Well, let's talk about polling. More numbers for those who enjoy that sort of thing. Last week, we talked about the polling in terms of how Canadians feel about the different candidates and what they know about the different candidates. I will say, even since the last week, I saw an Angus Reid polled out this week that has, again, Liberals and Conservatives very close at the top line numbers. They also have Pierre Poilievre basically on par with Justin Trudeau now in terms of net favorable. So not just, Carney rising, not just the Liberals rising, but also Poilievre sinking a little bit there. So that's interesting. But we want to talk about polling among Liberal members, registered Liberals this week. And, I'll say, look off the top as a pollster, this is a tough group to poll. Yes, 400,000 people signed up. Very exciting. That's 1% of Canadians. So, there's a lot of sampling error that comes into this. I think, whenever you're looking at polls among registered Liberals, you should obviously take that into consideration. It's a difficult group to poll. But, for that reason, it's important to poll it, and it's very useful to get polling from them because how they feel is going to be very different from just how Liberal voters feel. Somebody who is weird enough to take out a Liberal membership, or I guess these days just register. But nevertheless, you're still care enough to register and vote in a leadership race. Very different from somebody who just casually votes for the party in an election campaign. Over the weekend, Main Street Research put out a poll that was conducted among registered Liberals. The poll's paywalled, but the good people at Main Street said we could read off the top line numbers and give a bit
Thank
of
you,
a
Keto.
thank you. Give a bit of a general sense of what's happening there. Look, if you're interested in the details, like subscribe to their tracking. They're going to have more polls that come out in the next couple of weeks as well too. And I think it's really interesting to look at some of the regional breakdowns and that in terms of how the candidates are shaping out there. But in terms of the top line numbers, how are registered Liberals today leaning in this race? I'll just read off the numbers here. Carney, 38%. Freeland, 29%. Gould, 18%. Dalla, 5%. Frank Baylis, 2%. Though that doesn't really factor in the bump he's going to get after going on Race to Replace last week. I'm pretty sure next poll that Keto puts out, at least 2.5%, if not 3% for Frank Bayless after his great interview he gave with us last week on the podcast. And also another 8% undecided. Let me just throw a few more nuggets on the table, and then we can kind of open it up for people's thoughts on this. So Carney actually has the most second choice support, which is not always the case for frontrunners. Freeland leading in Alberta, leading in the prairies, close to Carney in Quebec. Karina Gould very close to Carney among younger voters, 18 to 34-year-olds. So look, I think the poll numbers here paint a picture of a race that is much closer than the fundraising numbers would suggest. So I don't know, what do we make of this disconnect here between fundraising and polling?
Well, maybe I'll go first. Look, so the polling actually lines up closer to what I would have expected this race to look like before we actually started it, if we had to like guess how it would potentially evolve, right? In the sense that Carney's leading, but he's not running away with it on the first ballot. And there's pockets of regional support for Freeland, but there's also high degree of resistance in certain places for her, in part, which I think we've heard and talked about before in the pod. Some people are quite upset with the way she left and potentially quote unquote knifed the prime minister. I think what's interesting though is the point you made, Dan, and you're obviously an Albertan on this, so tell me if you disagree with this, is the point about the prairies in Alberta, right? We've talked before about how Christia is a daughter of Alberta, so is, Mark Carney's the son of Alberta, Northwest Territories. But she has always, in her time in government, really been a voice of Alberta, both within the caucus and at the cabinet table. And so those numbers, to an extent, reflect that regional organization. Except what I have been hearing on the ground is that, Stephen Carter, for example, is quite active in helping Mark Carney and has apparently been cleaning up and organizing in the province. And Mark has done very well in some of the events that he's held in the province. And Christia's events have maybe been a little bit more sparsely attended, according to some data I've heard from. So, this is just an interesting point to reconcile with anecdata, because I think the polling is more consistent with what I would have expected, but it's not from what I've heard from organizers. And so I don't know how this will shake out. I do think, though, it's not evident necessarily that we will have a winner on the first ballot.
Yeah, I think to Tyler's point, like this, I think having a more competitive, we don't know for sure who has it, is good for the party, is good for energy for the party. It's also good for the candidates because coronations can get people a little sloppy. And I think like the biggest fear for Carney's camp is that because he's doing so well, that your voters may not come out. Your voters might be like, oh, do I need to like go through this, like get my ID, figure it out, and go on? Like that could be a process. If people don't want to do it, then you can risk that. And I think this can show to your voters like, hey, we don't actually have it cinched. So I need you to go out and vote. And it helps for GOTV efforts. But to what Tyler was saying about the Alberta and prairies, is that, remember the point system. So every riding is equally weighted. So you can have 50,000 people in Brampton. That's great. But if you have 50 people and you sweep every prairie or rural riding you have, that will help you come on top at the end of the day. And I think for Quebec, given that people have criticized Carney for his French, I think that he's close there, that they're competitive is quite interesting. But for liberals, I mean this wasn't the case for Stephen Harper. For liberals, the path to government is through Quebec. So I do wonder how people will think about that in terms of like who they choose. Now for Gould, the youth vote, I actually find that the youth, because of what's happening in the US and tariffs, they've been quite absent. And that was a key part for us in 2013 for leadership. I mean, the PM wanted his youth council. Like it was totally focused on youth. He went to a lot of universities. We did a lot of those hits. And I feel like their voice has been quite absent from this. Like I've seen the Young Liberals post their items, and I think that's important. But in terms of mainstream conversation, I don't see a lot of youth focus issues being talked about. Now that could give Gould a huge path. Like if you can mobilize enough youth to support her, to either whether to carry her forward or to get her issues in front of the person who becomes the prime minister, that could be a huge path for her. So I think how she goes to mobilize those people to get out the vote is going to be key.
Yeah, I think there's something for all the campaigns to be relatively happy about on polling numbers like this. And I guess that's usually the case. You spin polls to like say, oh, this is great news for us. But I think objectively looking at this here, from Carney's perspective, yes, below 50%, not a first ballot win. But the fact that he has a lot more second choice support than Freeland
Yeah.
really makes it difficult for her to leap him on future ballots. And this is how these races usually kind of get upsets, is because the front runner becomes polarized
That's
and
right.
everybody turns
That's right.
against the front runner. And then, as other candidates start to drop off, their second choices go up to the next person. And eventually the person who was in second or third or fourth in Stéphane Dion's case ends up leaping into the lead. But in this case, Carney actually has more second choice support than Freeland. So, he's the front runner in terms of support, but he's also less polarizing than the person in second place. So that certainly works to his advantage, both in terms of being able to win, maybe not first ballot, but still win. It also, I think, speaks to just the ability of the party probably to come together afterwards, to not have a winner who is polarizing, who there has broad support among supporters of other candidates. I think that probably would be good, after the fact. So that's a positive for them. For Freeland, I think, look, we've beat up on her a little bit this episode in terms of the fundraising numbers, but she's only 9 points back of Mark Carney on this poll. And that is something you can make up on ground game. That is something you can make
Yeah.
up with a good debate performance. And if she does work on some of those second choice numbers, there's certainly a pathway for her there. And if the media start looking at this race as like, hey, it's only a 9 point gap from first to second, I think that's better for her than the media looking at this race as in, it's over, Carney's won. So, to that end, I think polling like this is certainly good for her, just because it's going to make the race seem a bit more competitive. And then for Karina Gould, look, I think even for her, if she got 10% in this race, that would be good, setting herself up for roles in future Liberal governments, setting her up for future seasons of the race to replace. So 18% for her feels like a really good number. And if you squint hard enough there, just as you can say that Freeland could catch Carney for first, Gould could catch Freeland for second place. You could
Yes.
make that up on ground game or on a good debate
Yes.
performance. And then, once you get to second place, like, who knows where you go from there? Freeland supporters come to you. So, I think there's a path there for her. And look, I think a lot of mainstream media outlets have not really been taking her candidacy that seriously. But look, in our first episode, we all said, like, I think she's going to do well in this race. To your credit, Vandana, I think you said you thought she'd do better than Freeland in the race. Tyler and I had Freeland second on our scorecards, but you said, no, I think she's actually got a chance to, or will beat Freeland in this race. And I think, like, it could be moving in that direction. If you look at the fundraising numbers, if you look at some of these polling numbers here, that would not surprise me when all is said and done, either wise here.
Well, and the interesting thing here is, right, like both of these two events, the poll and the fundraising numbers, are going to change, I think, how the other candidates approach Karina in the remaining part of this race. Because up until now, I think they assumed she was further back. And they've been trying to, I'm told, behind the scenes, potentially court her, right? Because they know that she could be a kingmaker or queenmaker on a second ballot, potentially, or a third ballot, depending on what she wants to do if she stays in the race. And like now, clearly it's evident that she should stay in the race, and she actually could be, to both of your points, potentially competing for second. And so, what if you're Freeland or you're Carney? What do you do in terms of how you position yourselves vis-a-vis her? Are you trying to potentially, if you're a Christian, are you trying to woo her people in the same way? Can you woo her people in the same way? Because they may now have a sense of greater gravitas in this race and may not be open to wanting to be wooed, right? And so, how does that shake up things in the remaining number of days that we have? I don't think we expected this factor to play out this way.
So I don't think she's courtable. I think you're right. But I think I can see candidates wanting to see if, like, okay, would you come over here? But if you already paid all these dues and you were the underdog, like, you're gonna get to the end, right?
That's right.
Now, I think the smart thing for them to do is look at her policies and see what can create that ground game for me, right? And whether you say I support Karina's policy on, we're gonna talk about some of those things in a moment, or you're gonna do a stronger youth campaign. Like, I haven't seen those youth flanks out there, but if I think that's the best way. So maybe young people might be like, okay, well, you be my second now. I think, to get Karina's numbers out, that would be the only path forward. They have to really think through policy wise, who is supporting her and speak to them.
Yeah, it's almost like the way the Liberals kind of look at NDP voters in general elections. Like, you want to hug the NDP. Like, we always say this, like, don't attack the NDP. NDP voters don't like it when you attack them and you say mean things about their leader. Right. They want you to hug them, and then in the end they vote for you because they think you can win the election. So I think it's the same thing. Yeah, like, I think, like, if you're Carney or you're Freeland, you're saying nice things about Karina Gould, you're adopting some of her policies, you're trying to show that hug there so that their voters come to you on the second ballot. Or, as we talked about last week, like, that the NACV Nate Erskine
Mm-hmm.
Smith pact,
Mm-hmm.
like if it gets to the point where Freeland and Gould are pretty competitive for second place, like maybe they do a pact like that and say, let's mark each other second. Like that's, I think, an option that could be on the table as we get closer to voting period.
Well, and interestingly, if we look at the policy so far, and thank you, Vandana, for raising this before I did, um, there actually has been a fairly significant leftward shift, particularly both amongst Karina and Freeland in this campaign. And so, if you were just marking this in terms of where is that overlap, you would probably say that Karina and Freeland actually have had a lot more in common than you would have expected, right? They both talked about very significant spending commitments to address housing, to improve middle class affordability, some various tax cut proposals that have been on the table. Karina's gone further on a number of different fronts, but like if you're just looking to look at how, for example, one campaign or the other has positioned themselves to make themselves accessible to the other's voters, certainly there's an argument to be made there that Freeland has been trying to make herself accessible to Gould voters and vice versa.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think though, as much as like I think factually, like on paper, depending on what you're seeing when the policy makes sense, I think actually she'll be closer to Carney because I think Carney's first policy was on the environment, and he's talked about First Nations. I think also on the Rosemary Barton interview when he talked about Pierre Poilievre, he talked about he taxes if people aren't seniors and there aren't people who have disabilities and there are people we don't talk about First Nations, and I think like values wise, he would actually be. I think a lot of people think of him, and I've said this before, as this like center right person. I think fiscally, sure, that makes sense. But I think socially, I think you can argue that he does care about those things. He just hasn't been able to share them as much. So, I mean, maybe there's something to come, but we'll have to see.
Okay. We also have some polling among registered liberals from our former colleague, Alex Kohut, on his Substack. So everyone can check out his Substack. He's got lots of interesting questions there that he's been kind of rolling out over the past week or two about how registered liberals feel about different issues in this race. And he did a leadership or a candidate comparison and asked people, which of these candidates do you think is best on each of these different issues here? Look, Carney leads on everything, but if you look at the relative strengths of the candidates, it is kind of interesting. Where Gould is relatively strongest is on what we just talked about here, reconciliation, climate change, listening to Canadians, which is obviously a theme of her campaign. Freeland does well on those issues too. Her best issue, though, is actually healthcare. That's where Liberal voters trust her the most.
Carney, and yet she
as
said nothing about healthcare, which is fascinating. Sorry.
Yeah. I was thinking the same
Like
thing.
Nobody has said anything about healthcare, and yet,
At all.
yeah, exactly.
Actually,
which
Ruby
is
Dalla talked about
surprising.
healthcare today, so maybe we think about Ruby Dalla.
Carney is strongest, as you would expect, on the economy. He is strongest on giving the Liberals a chance to win, which is probably going to get even higher as more polls come out that show him ahead of Poilievre. He also, though, one of his best categories, managing the relationship with Donald Trump, which is what Chrystia Freeland has made her whole campaign about. But Carney is, at least according to this polling, well ahead of her on that question of, who's trusted most on that issue. And we can probably get into, when we talk about kind of debate prep, what this means for the candidates. But any thoughts on this here?
Well, look, I mean, I would say that it was surprising. And this isn't the only poll that has showed Carney ahead on how to deal with Trump, right? Like, there's been, I think, a bunch of different polls that have come out in the space of the last week or so that have, at least even amongst the general public, not let alone amongst Liberal voters, asked the question of which of the candidates do you trust best to deal with Trump, and Carney seems to be consistently ahead on that. So, I mean, to Alex's point that he's made, perhaps this is not an issue that Freeland wants to keep pushing on. But that being said, I think the reason that she's pushing on it is because it is the thing that if you know something about Chrystia Freeland, you know that she has been tied to Donald Trump. So it may just be a way into how to talk about her and to tell her story more than it is about an issue. But I do find it interesting looking at the Angus Reid poll also that we saw come out today on Tuesday on the economy. She and Carney are actually fairly equally balanced. It's interesting that Carney also has a lead on inflation, which is what you would expect, right? Because he's been a former central banker, he has credibility in that sense. So to the extent that you start to pick apart these things in terms of narratives, that it's not just about the broad question of affordability or the broad question of the economy, but it's about more specific issues underlying that. It's interesting to see how these things sort out, because again, not exactly how we I think would have originally scored this at the beginning.
I think the interesting for me is that like I'm not surprised the economy and the Donald Trump thing. I think because early on, as much as Christopher Freeland, her base was on Donald Trump, she started off with saying, "Well, as you know, he doesn't like me." Which is like
Mhm.
kind of fun, but I think at the same time, if you wanted someone who you're going to deal with, and as like the consistent crazy of like what's happening down south is rolling out and affecting all of us, affecting Europe and others, you may be like, I don't really want someone he doesn't like. I want someone he can deal with. And I think like the problem is for her now is to pivot because I don't, as much as you mentioned her housing policy piece, I've only heard her Donald Trump piece, right? And that's all
Yeah.
she's been talking about, even in the US on media she's done there. So I think it'd be hard for her to pivot at this point, but we'll have to see what the debates come through. And then, that might give her a lead there. But I think, Carney, and I hate to say it, but like, you look at him, he looks like what a leader looks like for a lot of people. He's a man, he has gray hair, he looks like a statesman, like the way you kind of picture one. So I think people are just scared right now and they also want to lean on him. But he obviously has credentials, but I think again the hard part for Kristia is that switch. But I'm not surprised seeing that or to see that people just relate to Gould and Gould like she's always been progressive on issues. So I'm not surprised. I think for Gould, like it'll be great to see how she can pull out some maybe more economic pieces. I don't think she has a path there, but at least to show there's something there.
I'm Hamas, and this is Simon, and we live in Surrey. We started hosting on Airbnb because we thought we had the spare room and why not share it with people? When our guests come in, first thing usually they ask is, I'm really hungry, it's been a really long flight, can you recommend a place? Usually Simon is really good with that. He knows all the good spaces. Because we got a lot of good reviews and people commented on the overall look of the space, I was like, okay, maybe I can do this for a living. It actually gave me the courage to start school in interior design. It made such an impact on us financially, and I don't know, I think we're happier because we started Airbnb for sure.
While we're talking about policies and Korean Gould's policies, let's bring up our unanimous consent segment here, which we do every couple of weeks. This is where we look at a policy announcement that was made over the past week on the campaign, and we look at it through three different lenses. Tyler gives it a yay or a nay. Is this good policy? I give it a yay or a nay. Will this help the Liberals win in a general election? Vandana gives it a yay or a nay. Will this help this candidate in the leadership race itself mobilize votes? And this week, Karina Gould talked a little bit about basic income. Tyler, you want to kind of explain to us what this is all about and what she's promising?
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting, very interesting proposal from Karina Gould in the sense that it's a little bit less detailed than some of the other proposals that we've seen from her or from the other candidates, but it's very much a values-based announcement, right? And this is, when we talk about policy, obviously policy is sometimes driven to specifics in order to try to mobilize people around specific ideas, but sometimes it's also to express values, right? It's to express how you believe differently on a particular topic. And in this case, what she said is, I want to do a 1 year review. And remember, she's a former minister of social development and at ESTC, and so this is something that I think she's thought about a little bit from her prior time in government. And so she said that she wants to do a 1 year review of our social safety net to basically achieve five different objectives. So number one is to reduce paperwork for applicants. Number two is to get people livable supports quickly and effectively. Number three is to increase support for seniors. Interesting that she's underlined seniors because that's a voting group that's both important to the general public and certainly within the commission structure of the Liberal Party of Canada. Four, provide a more dignified existence to people living with disabilities. Also interesting because in the last couple of years, we've had a very significant policy development around the Canada Disability Benefit, which has been somewhat controversial because of the degree of support that the government has offered versus what was expected by stakeholders. And lastly, that opens a path to establishing a basic income. Now, she doesn't specifically offer a commitment to a universal basic income. She's not even saying to do a pilot project the way we've seen at the provincial level. And she's not saying if we did a basic income, what that would look like. But she's wanting to put this issue on the table. Why? And I would argue why? Because she knows that Liberals care about big ideas. And what we have seen consistently throughout the polling that Alex Kohut and others have done is that liberals want to hear ambitious, bold policy ideas. They want to be engaged on a big, new, transformative idea. And basic income is something that if anyone has attended a policy convention for Liberal Party of Canada in the last number of years, you will often hear that particular topic come up in discussions and in policy resolutions. So I think she's putting this forward in order to lean into a cleavage of idea in the party that has been very active for the last number of years.
So what do you think, Tyler? Yay or nay?
Well, I say yay because I think it's a debate worth having. I'm glad that somebody's actually raising this debate. It's also, by the way, something that builds on the history and legacy of the party on the Canada Child Benefit, right? That's a version of a basic income that we've created for families, also similar to what we've done with OAS and GIS for seniors. Interesting that she also called out seniors in that proposal, even though they already have a version of their own basic income. But so I think it's a good thing to do, but it's the kind of thing that unless you have specifics, it probably won't go anywhere in government, right? Because this is the kind of thing that will be mired in lots of debate with stakeholders.
Vandana, do you think this gets her votes or not in the leadership race?
I think it does. And I think going back and Tyler references Kathleen Wynne's pilot project, and I think that was very popular amongst people who are more progressive on the left spectrum. And I think going back to her framing, she's trying to show compassionate government. And I think there's still room for that. I think we still haven't learned a lot of lessons from COVID-19 in terms of healthcare workers, how we treat seniors, et cetera. And I think she's sharing that. Like, I have a vision for a compassionate Canada. And she's talking about the most vulnerable. Now, for universal basic income, I agree with you, Tyler. People want big ideas. And when she launched her campaign, she talked about, same-sex marriage. She talked about legalizing marijuana. So perhaps this could be the path for the big thing that she becomes, she started off that she creates, right? So I think it's going to be really popular. So again, going back to if people think Carney's a shoo-in, people might be like, I actually want to send a signal that I really care about these things, so I'm going to vote for her. A story on universal basic income that I, personally, one of my really good friends, she grew up in foster care. Her mother had just severe mental health issues and couldn't take care of her. And she received that from Kathleen Wynne's government. And she was happy her mom was able to get some help and have a respectable, living, and was taken away. The first thing she said to me was like, how can you take that away from somebody? She's like, I saw how much help she was able to have and how she was able to live in dignity. So I think Karina can take real stories like that and prefer an argument. And I know, Tyler, I know there's going to be stakeholder issues and budgetary issues and all that, but you can still create a path to something for when the country is ready for something like that.
And liberals love talking about poverty reduction, right? Like, Dan, you can correct me here, but this is one of those issues where it's good politics and good policy, right? In the sense that, the CCB, as we've seen as an example, is a way to transfer lots of money to lots of people, but it also has a significant impact on reducing poverty. And those being able to talk about those two things, both giving people money to a broad base that helps, middle-class families, but also has the effect of raising people out of poverty. That's something that liberals and Canadians, but liberals in particular, love. It really gets their gears going and why they believe in the idea of the Liberal Party of Canada to do that social good.
Yeah, I think liberals in particular, and you mentioned this earlier, but one of Alex's polls that he put out among registered liberals shows 78% support a guaranteed basic income. I also think the people who support this are fanatical about this. This is like the electoral reform people in the sense that they want to talk to you about guaranteed basic income and they'll corner you in a convention with pamphlets and have you heard about guaranteed basic income and how this will change the country. And I think those are the type of people that will turn out to vote and maybe would even change the candidate they're going to vote for based on a policy like this, just as the electoral reform people are very fanatical about their beliefs as well too. So yeah, I think internally it helps in a leadership race. From my side of the unanimous consent kind of segment we do here with the broader public, I'm not quite as convinced on this one. I have tested this in a few provinces over the past couple of years for provincial parties that were kind of dabbling with the idea. And look, when you ask it straight up, most people at first blush like the idea, but it doesn't pull as highly as other affordability measures like tax cuts or taking taxes off different utilities and things like that. So again, if you're kind of having to pick where your money's going to go and what your centerpiece is, I don't know if I want to make this the centerpiece of a Liberal campaign platform in 2025, at least. If I was running Jagmeet Singh's campaign, I might think about it. Like they're not playing for 40%, they're playing for 20%. It would get some headlines. It might make them a bit more relevant. Like it wouldn't surprise me if the NDP went this direction. I don't know if I would necessarily want the Liberal Party to put this as a centerpiece plank in their next campaign platform. Maybe as you mentioned, Vandana, I do the pilot program or something like that. But I don't think I would go full in on this as kind of like this is our affordability measure today. All right, so we are denied unanimous consent, unfortunately, then.
Greetings, Canadian Political Pod listener. I'm your narrator, Gary, an artificial intelligence-generated voice. Exciting and serious sounding is what we typed in the AI voiceover input field. And boom, Gary exists. Hey, do you know what's not artificial? Not even one bit? The highly influential audiences air quotes media podcasts offer to its advertisers. And I say that with all the sincerity a machine learning data-optimized predictive network of interconnected neural nodes can muster. Whether your ad message is on Curse of Politics, the Burly, Hotel Pacifico, or the brand new Race to Replace, you will be reaching cabinet ministers, members of parliament, the political class, the C-suite, and corporate Canada, leading journalists, and tens of thousands of engaged Canadians. People saying this is a unique political moment is underselling it. Policy is under scrutiny. A party leader is being voted on. The Ontario election is underway. There will be a new prime minister. And then there's the guy living in the White House who calls us the 51st state. Does anyone remember another time like this? I'm instantly scouring millions of data points to answer my own rhetorical question. No, you do not. This is when you need to get your message to the decision makers. Email us at contact@airquotesmedia.com. You'll be dealing with Jill and Todd, who are real, not artificial at all people, and generally very friendly. Well, Jill is anyway. We're still deciding about Todd.
Let's bring in our favorite segment. It is time for the Mulcair Minute.
I know more than most, believe me. My analysis as someone in politics for a long time, I think that Mr. Charest is going to make very quick work of Pierre Poilievre.
Vandana, you've got a Mulcair Minute for us this week?
I do. It is by Campbell Clark. It's an opinion piece in the Globe and Mail saying Liberal leadership race isn't contest that isn't testing anyone. And I think some people in the beginning, when Dom dropped and Melanie Joly dropped, and it was just Carney and Freeland, I think people just thought that. But I think we've seen that this is, and what we talked about earlier in the segment, the numbers of donors. I think you've seen that there is a race here, even if Mr. Carney's out front. He says, so far it hasn't been much of a game. You would say it's enough of a showcase select. You wouldn't say it's enough of a showcase to select Team Canada. It isn't even telling Liberals who can really play. It doesn't look like it's starting to get a lot better. Now, I will say a lot of Carney's criticism early on was, is he too much like Ignatieff? Is he too elitist? I think we've seen with large crowds, his engagements, there's been really good visuals of him shaking hands, smiling. I actually thought it was really smart of him to not go to the game and actually watch it here in Ottawa. I think that shows that, Pierre Poilievre was out in the stands. I'm sure those tickets are very expensive. But he was with Canadians and he was having a beer, wearing his jersey that most people were doing. So I think like that showing that you can do this, like you could bring out crowds. You could be, the picture today with him in the middle, he was at, I think, McMaster, surrounded by people. That was something I would have seen. And I think the other thing you've seen is that Gould is a viable candidate. So I think that as like over the years, people have come to me and asked, I'm not doing anything now, but I would like to think about being the leader one day. And I always asked, tell me what your tours are like. What do you want to do? And I find that the people who, when they start experiencing the grueling, actually like job of the prime minister, which is not just the sexy, like I can sit in the office, I can make decisions for the country, but like you're going to ridings in the middle of nowhere sometimes. You're meeting with people, you're shaking hands, you're hearing feedback, positive and negative. Sometimes you're getting rocks thrown at you, as we've seen. It's quite difficult. And I think the grueling campaign can show you who has the chops to do it, you know? So despite Freeland not having big crowds, she's still meeting people across the country. And sometimes those small houses make a big difference. And again, Karina Gould, same thing. Like we're seeing it now. Like she's not pulling in these huge crowds, but she's doing quite well across the country.
Yeah,
And
she had
getting
over
donors.
150 people in Calgary, I was told. Like that for Karina and in Calgary, that's a very significant outcome.
Yeah, so I do think that when this race started, I was kind of worried. I'm like, oh. But I would say that this actually is testing these leaders because even if you're not testing, even if like you are not thinking Karina Gould's the prime minister, you're now like, you're somebody. And maybe you're going to be a future cabinet minister who's going to have a huge role under Carney's government, perhaps, or Freeland's government or wherever. But I think you're still testing people for their messaging, their ability to communicate, tour and operations, which is obviously my favorite, but also, testing how they can connect with people. And the most important thing, despite, policy chops and all that, is like, politics is not a policy game. I'm sorry, Tyler. It is a people game. So there's no point in having those policy if it doesn't connect to people. So there is policy. I'm saying how it connects to people. But I think that's really important. And what a candidate who's going to be successful is going to be a person that connects to the most amount of Canadians because they have to get to know you from their TV, from their podcast, from what they read. And they have to learn about you through imagery. All of us have been able to serve prime ministers and leaders. Not everyone does. So what can they get from these people? So I do think this race has been able to test those chops for all the candidates in different ways.
Okay, well, one way that the candidates will be tested is in the debates that are coming up next week. So the English debate Monday, French debate next Tuesday on the 25th. So we will be talking about the debates on our next podcast, which will probably drop the day after the debates. So again, thank you to the party for scheduling them to fit our schedule there. What I want to kind of talk about here is, if the campaigns, and I guess the candidates are doing their debate prep this week, then they're going to be getting ready. They're going to be running through the mock debates and the drills. And, we should give a little bit of advice to them and, what should they each be thinking about as they are going through and prepping for the debate next week. We've talked a little bit about, where they sit in the race overall, and we've talked a little bit about some of their brand strengths. If we were giving advice to the major campaigns, what would we tell them to be doing right now? Maybe I'll just start it off. Any advice that people would give to all the candidates in the debate? Like, what's one thing that you think for all the candidates they really need to pay attention to heading into the debates next week? Tyler, anything that comes to mind for you there?
So, look, we're obviously going to be watching the debate through the lens of being liberals, but I suspect the debates are actually going to attract a significant amount of viewership from the general public as well, just out of curiosity, because people will start to be tuned in to the race just before they start voting, because we're selecting a prime minister. And so the whole purpose of these debates, I think, from the party's perspective, is to test the chops the candidates have of how they will appear in an actual general election debate against Pierre Poilievre in particular. And so, like in the way that Frank Bayless did very effectively in our last episode, I encourage people to go and watch it if they haven't had a chance. You got to nail that 30-second clip of how you're different or why you're different than Pierre Poilievre and why Pierre Poilievre's version of Canada is not one that we want and why your vision of Canada is one that we want. So in some ways, you actually need to almost forget that there's other people on the stage, right, that you're debating with, even though you're obviously trying to court whoever within the universe of Liberal voters may come to you on a second ballot. But really, you're actually talking to the general public. And I think Liberals will in some ways also be motivated by who they vote for based on the answer to that question of who looks and sounds like a competitor in a general election that's able to go up against Pierre Poilievre. Because I think even for the three of us, my sense was that when we listened to Frank last week, he actually had a pretty good answer to that question in a way that at least somebody who's known him and who's been following this race very closely, I hadn't heard him express before, and that surprised me. And I'm not saying that I would necessarily take a second look at him as a candidate, but there's a way in which the debate can do that, can provoke that moment for voters in this race.
Vandana, what's your piece of advice for all the candidates?
So every debate I've watched has at some point gone into an argumentative process where everyone's talking over each other and someone has lost like the plot. So in that reign, I'm going to quote something that Kate Purchase has said over the years, our former director of comms, but talk like people talk. This is not debate
Yes.
club in university. It is still political theater. So you
She hounded
have
that into us. Yes.
hounded that. Like, and and that's going to be the most important because it's not just the debate. People have to hear you and understand you. It has to be something that's easy for them to digest. It's also something that you can clip easily and use later. So be plain spoken and talk like people talk.
Yeah, I was going to say for my advice, same as Tyler. I think yeah, I'm actually surprised how little we've heard about Pierre Poilievre in this leadership race. Like it's all been about Trump,
Mhm.
but we haven't heard the candidates maybe formulating their theory of the case for why they should defeat Pierre Poilievre. As you mentioned, Frank Bayless, I think did a pretty good job of that on our podcast last week. I really liked Karina Gould's Timbit Trump branding of
I
Poilievre that
love
she
it.
put out
I
today. I
love
think
it.
that's just it's just a nice little like make him seem so insignificant and small. So I think that was kind of fun. But you
Mhm.
look at like Carney's campaign. I've heard at least 5 or 6 different attacks against Polyev there. It's experience versus incompetence, plan versus slogan, calm versus chaos, team versus terror. He's going to make cuts, and I think he needs to kind of land on like what is his again, like you said, 30-second clip. What is his defining reason for why Poilievre should not be prime minister, and just pick one thing, not 10 things, and just unpack it and explain it. On our pod last week, like Frank Bayless picked one thing about the career politician. I actually would never run on that against him in the general election. I think like career politician is not a vote winner because people say like, well, he's got experience then. And I don't think that really
Mm.
would win it. But I love that Bayless like took one thing, really unpacked it, explained how he was different than Poilievre, explained why it was important, explained how it actually impacted voters and things at the end of the day. And I think, for all of the candidates, I would pick one thing and try to like really explain why um, Poilievre should not be prime minister, because I think that's going to be important because that's what you're going to have to do in the general election. And this is an addition for the general election.
Can
Let's,
I ask the both of you? Sorry, can I just ask the both of you? Like, given this moment and that the debates are going to happen next week, in this kind of moment that we're in as a country of patriotism, where we're rediscovering our patriotic identity as Canadians, how do you think that will play into the way in which the leaders themselves position themselves? Like, who on that stage is going to say, I'm Captain Canada to go up against the guy who wants to say that Canada's broken? Like, I'm kind of looking for an answer on that. And I have to say, at this stage, I don't see an obvious answer. I've heard some part of answers to that question, but on the patriotism angle, who do you think, could nail that?
I think they're all going to hold hands
Yeah.
and sing "O Canada" together to close the debate.
I agree.
That's
I
my
agree.
prediction for next week.
In all of us command.
Well, let's maybe talk about Freeland specifically then, because she's been trying to play up the Captain Canada
Yeah.
angle. What does Freeland need to do next week? Tyler, do you think she needs to like take on that Captain Canada mantle, or as we said, like should she try to pivot to other issues? Like, what do you think she should be talking about in the debate?
Well, I mean, my first piece of advice goes a little bit along the lines of what we said in the last pod. She needs to forget that she was ever the finance minister of Canada, right? Like she needs to not be so focused on trying to drill home certain data arguments about how Canada compares to other countries for inflation or economic growth. She just needs to Vandana's point, actually show that she can communicate. Because I think one of the criticisms of Freeland, independent of the criticism of if you don't like the way she brought down the prime minister, the consistent criticism of her before all of that was that she wasn't a very good communicator, right? That she had difficulty empathizing and connecting with people, and sometimes sounded like she talked down to people. I don't think that's fair, but I think that is a very realistic representation of what you would hear from caucus members, right? And so I think that is a lingering concern that a lot of people have. Can she dispel that by being able to actually talk in more emotive and direct ways, even telling stories about some of the people that she's met along the course of this campaign? She actually is, as a former journalist, good at telling stories. I've seen her do it one-on-one with people very well. I would encourage her to try to find that version of herself. And it will require her perhaps to use a slightly different rhythm than she is used to, because that rhythm, I think, is also part of the problem of how she communicates. But I would encourage her to really go into telling a story about what she's discovered and learned of people's individual experiences and lives in this campaign.
So I think a different take on it in the sense that I'm going to go through like there's comms in media. And I think debates are generally hard for women. And I think you always hear afterwards, like what they wore, how they sounded. Women's voices are higher. We're all a bit more shrill, perhaps. And I think sometimes, like, what happens, like, she's going to have to walk this line that a lot of women have to walk, which is you can't be too combative and look like you're unhinged because other people will see, but you can't be too lax and then don't look like you don't have power. So she's going to have to find that median ground, which is tough for all women. And and it's hard when I just find debates like the way they're set up can be very difficult, especially as I said. Oftentimes you lose track in the moment, people start speaking over each other, and do you choose to keep going across, or do you pick the Kamala moment where you say, I'm still speaking, like, I had to finish, right? So I think for her, yes, I think humanizing her, but I think actually I would just show that like I can be in charge here. And I have been in charge. Like I can stand up to him. I think this is actually like she is still should like show position herself as running against Carney. So what can she do? She has experience and she can still show herself to be the boss that she has been. So I think that's what she should do.
Yeah, I think she does need to knock Carney off his game a little bit here.
Yeah.
If we're assuming that she's 10 points back or maybe more from him in the polls. But I think increasingly, as people see polls with Carney outperforming her, they're going to think Carney's our ticket to win the election. So she needs to have people look at this debate and say, hey, wait a minute, Carney sounds good on paper, but in practice, he can't handle a debate. Poilievre's going to eat him alive. Chris just seems a lot more stable and she can handle herself up there. So she's got to look good comparatively to him, which is tough because you don't end up being the person that like has the clip that ends up in conservative attack ads, like, ripping Carney a new one in the debate, right? So I think she needs to like throw him off his game in more subtle ways. In the French debate, that's probably easier, right? Like she's probably got better French than him. So, I think like ask him some questions about obscure concepts that he probably hasn't prepped for in French and like see him if he can actually handle himself on his feet in his second language. Like that could be tough for him if he gets a question that he hasn't prepped for, maybe with some, obscure French terms thrown in there and maybe make him look a little bit weaker there. So I think that's something she could do there. In English, I don't know what the thing is. I don't think you want to necessarily attack him like personally. I think that usually backfires on you. But I think she's got to find a way to at least throw something his way that makes him look a little bit unsteady in the debate, because she does need to come out of this looking more viable than him and look like a stronger debater than him.
It's interesting you say that, Dan, because and I'm not. This immediately popped into my head while you were describing it. It's not to say that this analogy is exactly true, but I remember in 2019, right? We were going through some rough patches in the campaign, and we actually. Yes, that was a bit of a shit show as a campaign. Anyway, the French debate was part of the path back, right? And it was interesting that the French debate was sequenced first, right, before the English debate, because we knew we could get Scheer off of his game because he didn't speak French very well, right? So to the extent, and I'm not saying that Mark Carney's Andrew Scheer in this context, but to the extent that that Carney is, to your point, Dan, not as strong in French, she Freeland is stronger in French and Gould is stronger in French. They can both use that superiority that they have in the French language potentially to lay some traps, and then as we go into the next debate, right, we think differently potentially about the race because of that performance, even though it was always going to be that way just because of language, right? So it's interesting that it's sequenced that way. And I remember in 2019 that actually did have an effect about kind of how the prime minister was positioned, particularly in Quebec, going into that English debate subsequently.
Yeah, I think actually not technical things that'll throw them off. I think it's just about speaking to Quebecers as Quebecers want to be heard. So I think actually sharing narrative, showing like you understand being that small town that is focused on aluminum. And like I don't like to put in that human narrative, like he's probably used to technical briefings, but to have like just a relaxed conversation where you can really connect to Quebec viewers and voters, I think that will be the one that I think that can throw him off his game.
Yeah. Any other advice for Carney? That's a good tidbit there. Tyler, anything else you'd give Carney advice for?
I think it'll be interesting to see whether Carney comes out with more of a platform document, quote unquote, that he drops before the debate. I would argue perhaps he might want to do that because, again, it would also be a way to get his opponents a bit on their heels. Because I think they have, certainly on policy, they've put it more out there than he has. He's been using more of his interviews and his rallies to throw concepts out there that don't yet have kind of backgrounders or anything like that. But to the extent that he can put more detail out in front, I actually think it will insulate him from the attack that he hasn't really said anything or hasn't defined himself really on a lot of issues. Then for some voters that may raise more questions that are yet unanswered. So he might want to do that before the debate, and then it also could potentially distract his opponents on the day of. So it'll be interesting to watch whether that happens.
I think he should borrow from Gould a bit and humanize himself a bit and share those stories. I think he already has like a pass on the economy. So I think he has to show, what else can I do? Can I show compassion? Can I show these stories? Can I talk about people? And the other thing, on the Pierre Poilievre thing, I actually wonder, and I'm going back and forth in my mind about this, that similar to how sometimes we look at the NDP, like just don't mention them, like they're insignificant, don't mention them. I almost wonder if you want to do that to him. Like he's not a factor. It's only us versus Trump, and that's the only option out there. And put that in Canadian psyche. I'm not sure that can work, but something that I've been thinking about, whether does it make sense to bring him up as an option, or does it make sense to actually just like focus on you versus Trump?
That's interesting. Yeah, I would say when it comes to Carney, I think his policy positions are completely irrelevant in this debate. I don't think any liberals cares at all what his policy positions are going to be in this debate. All they care about is that he stands up there and sounds like he is a capable communicator. And then he can handle himself against Poilievre in a general election. This is kind of the proxy for that, which is why, if you want my hottest take of this entire podcast here, my hottest take is I'm extremely happy that Ruby Dalla made her $350,000 deposit limit, because she is going to go into these debates and she is going to attack Mark Carney the exact same way Pierre Poilievre will attack Mark Carney in the general election, as we've seen from our Pierre or Ruby segment that we've done the last 2 weeks. So I think this will be a great training ground for Carney to see how he responds to those types of attacks. And, I think the best thing he can do is if he handles those types of attacks well in this debate, that will show people that, hey, maybe he can handle himself when he comes under a little bit of heat in an actual debate.
So just to defend my honor as a policy analyst on this pod, I'm not saying the policy and his policy positions in the debate is going to win him the debate. I agree with both of you that it will come down to whether or not they sound like a person that would stand on that liberals would be happy to have stand on a stage against Pierre Poilievre in a general election debate, and can they feel him? Can they feel him or her in that moment being able to do that and deliver those punches effectively against a Pierre Poilievre opponent? All I'm saying, though, is I think if there is a mark against Carney in this race that I think both Freeland and Gould might play on in the debate, they might make the case, look, you keep saying we need a serious plan, but I don't see a plan. What's the plan? When are we going to get the plan, right? You could almost invent that kind of a moment in a debate just in that rhetoric that I gave there, right? And so it would be to his benefit to address that vulnerability a little bit in advance, just by dropping something on the day of, the way we know candidates sometimes do the day of a debate, right, in order to address a vulnerability or to put their opponents off their game. I just think that would be an interesting tactic. But again, I'm not saying that the policy is going to win that debate.
All right, what about Karina Gould? We talked a bit about her this campaign. She's looking more viable probably than she did a couple weeks ago. Vandana, what should she do in this debate? How does she kind of build on that momentum and look even more viable coming out of it?
I think she should show that fire she shows in the House of Commons, that unless you're nerds like us who watch Question Period, despite not working there anymore, that people don't see. So I think she's been good at attacking Pierre Poilievre. She does get under his skin in the House. She sounds very powerful in the House. I think showing that, I think the problem with sometimes the way she does things is, sadly, and I hate saying this because I love Karina, she sounds a bit like a kindergarten teacher. And I think people need to see the fire that she 100% has, that I've seen her showcase. And I think actually the win will be for Karina at the end. I think at the end, if she can really set herself apart here and show a side of her that Canadians haven't seen, show power, show how she has kind of owns these positions, but also can push back on somebody, and including maybe they don't picture with Trump, but they can picture her pushing back on an opposition member, on Pierre Poilievre, using her as an attack dog. So I'd like to see her in a bit of in that kind of format.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think if you're trying to think of what is the biggest knock or hesitation people have about her, and this is probably honestly it's gendered. It's probably because she's a younger woman. They say yeah, I really like Karina, but she couldn't handle Trump, and
Hmm.
she couldn't take on Polyev. Like she couldn't do that. So I think she's got to kind of build that confidence and that she
Yep.
can handle Polyev, that she can handle Trump, and that probably means, like you said, yeah, sounding forceful, not like not attacking the other candidates on the
No.
stage in a forceful way. I think that would really backfire on her. But I think she has to give those runs of like why Polyev is going to ruin the country and why Donald Trump is awful and show a bit of fire, show a bit of heat there. I think that would be very much in her, what she needs to get out of it. Like I've done testing out of, focus groups and Dell groups and post-debate surveys for many, many debates. And the thing that always people are looking for in a candidate is confidence. Like that's the
Yeah.
word they always say when someone has a good debate, is they sounded confident up there.
Hmm.
Not arrogant, but confident. And I think she just needs to get up there and show that confidence in her plan, in her vision, in what she is saying, in herself. And if that, confidence comes through, I think that will go a long way to giving people confidence in her that she can take on, Polyev or Trump.
I think she's also probably perfectly positioned of all the candidates, right, in terms of how she wants to enter this debate, because she has, I know you're saying don't go strong against the other candidates, but she actually has probably the most cover if she wanted to be able to do that, right? She has an ability probably to attack Christia on, that's what you're saying is not exactly how you acquitted yourself at the cabinet table, Christia, right? So she has that ability to question Christia, and she also has the ability because she's the, potentially in second or third, but she's somebody who all of the other candidates need if they're going to win potentially, or certainly may want to court, right? She has the ability to also go up against Carney and to question his credentials as a liberal potentially if she wanted to do that. If you go back to the podcast interview that we did with her, she had a really interesting story. She could pinpoint the moment she knew she was a liberal, the moment that she wanted to run for the party, the moment that she got involved in her EDA. Telling that story, because this is obviously both an audience of liberals and then an audience of the general public, but telling that story, I think will remind her that will remind the voters in this race that she's a candidate who is a true grit, who is somebody who knows what the values are of the party that she wants to lead, and is intent to do the long rebuilding effort of the party should we find ourselves in opposition. So I think actually Karina's probably in the best position of all of the candidates because she has the least to lose. She has the ability to kind of float between both insider and outsider, and she has the ability to be able to question the other candidates in a way that they can't hit back at her so strongly.
I think that's the other thing I'd say for her is that she should play to her strengths too, which is
Hmm.
kind of like that she connects well with people. And you
Yeah.
don't get up there and say, I connect well with people. You have to show it. So I think, she's got to do exactly what Vandana was recommending for the other candidates. And probably this is good advice for all the candidates is, you show you connect with people by telling the stories of the person you've met. And I was out and I met Mike from Canmore last week, and he says there hasn't been a liberal leader that's been to his riding in 20 years, and that's going to change when I'm leader. We're going to go to all parts of the country and build up riding associations. Or I met Anne from Prince Edward Island, and she said that her kids can't afford new sneakers now because of how expensive life's gotten. So that's why I'm going to take the GST off kids' clothing because we need to help people. And I think connecting with voters that way is something she does very well, and I think the other candidates probably need to do a bit of as well too. Okay, we've had a lot of fun tonight, but now it is time to stop the clock. So this is the segment in the show where we kind of give somebody either a thumbs up, a thumbs down, something they did well this week, something they didn't do well this week. Who's got someone they want to give a bit of a shout out to here to start us off?
Well, I'll go first. I've got actually two ups that I'm going to give. So obviously, first is Taquito Maggie. Thank you for doing the polling that you're doing, and Alex Kohut, I guess, too. We really appreciate having the polling. It's hard to do of Liberal members, and for anyone who's not for the faint of heart, polling is a very hard thing to do in this particular context. So thank you for doing it. The second thing I would say is I want to give a shout out particularly to the Karina Gould campaign for an announcement we didn't talk about very much in this pod, but she did put out a really interesting release this week on entrepreneurs and how to grow innovation. Again, I've talked about the kind of leftward drift of some of the policy proposals we've seen in this campaign. This is the first really interesting, really substantive piece that's out there about how we grow the economic pie, as it were, including with a very ambitious goal of how do we make 1 million more entrepreneurs over the next number of years. So I encourage people to go read it. It's a really interesting, thoughtful piece.
Dan, I'll just point out that Tyler's talking about other pollsters, and you're my favorite pollster. So just remember that.
So
I would say
this is your thumbs up this week. It's to me for
it's to Dan to be my favorite pollster. I think my up would go to just Karina showing herself to be a viable candidate, to showing that she is support across the country. So I think I would give her an up for that, because she was definitely underestimated, and she's showing her prowess here.
Yeah, I think all the candidates actually deserve a bit of a thumbs up, even Ruby Dalla, for making that $350,000 limit. That was a very aggressive target the party set as an entry
Yeah.
fee, but they all did it. So great job to all of them. But I think I have to give my thumbs up here to the Carney campaign, because $1.9 million is a lot of money. That's going to leave money left over for them to spend money probably after this leadership campaign on ads and setting up the next election campaign. So really impressive fundraising numbers. So really well done to the whole fundraising team over with the Carney camp for bringing in the big dollars. We'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, Airbnb. And we'll see you next week for some post-debate reaction on the next leg of the race to replace.